Thank you very much. And we have a small group, so let's try to make this as interactive as possible. We did a variant of this earlier in the week for the broader conference, and we're going to be doing a smaller number of slides, and we're going to have a lot more discussion about your use cases, and we're also going to have more discussion about the use cases from our experiences. So just for a word of introduction, we got a little bit there from Mary D. Thank you very much. And we thought it would be nice to have some pictures and to remind you that we all love metadata, even when we don't know we're talking about it. We have ways that we label things, no matter where we go. And this is Dorothy with Toto, AKA Sandy with...
That's me on Halloween with my new puppy. That was Dorothy.
And that's I in Australia. I just came back from Australia where I was speaking at a bunch of different conferences. And we really love metadata and fuzzy things. So we wanted to start with a business imperative. And by the way, this is probably going to be knocking your socks off because these numbers are pretty big. On average, this is a study that was done by Microsoft and a consulting firm working with Microsoft a year ago. On average, individuals spend almost 2 hours a week searching for information or trying to understand their corpus of information. Big numbers, particularly when you multiply it by the number of US workers. I mean, so these are all averages, but that is $13.2 billion worth of opportunity costs that the US is sacrificing. And sorry, that's $628 billion of opportunity costs. This is 13.2 billion hours based on average daily rates. And you know it's probably larger for your organization if you have knowledge workers who have rates that are higher than the average rates across the US. So these are big numbers, and these are the kinds of numbers you're going to be talking about, not just simply for search, but information governance, having some of the issues around not being able to find, but also being able to have multiples of documents that need to be managed and tracked, or issues around personally identifiable information, which needs to be tracked, lest you end up with fines. Do you want to describe this slide for me?
I will, and I'm actually going to go down here because I like to walk around and move, and I'm afraid I'll fall off. So I'm just going to stand down here, and that way I can see you all a little bit better. So I know there's a couple different conferences here. Are you guys all familiar with GDPR? The European regulation? Okay, so these are the proposed fines for these two organizations. One of them is the owner of this room right now. And these are fines that result from essentially failing to protect, or there can be other violations, personal data in the EU. So this is pretty serious stuff. This is, by the way, per incident. So you can get hit again and again and again.
So, yeah, you're wrestling a little bit. She's not wrestling, she's wrestling. So if you want to take it and move it down on your thing, you can put it like on your
Maybe I'll put it on this
pendant here. So GDPR is just one reason why you want to be able to have a bird's eye view of your assets, but being able to know what's in your corpus of information across all different types of platforms, all different types of files, all different types of owners, and all different geographies, translates into not just protecting you from those kinds of lawsuits, but it also represents opportunity. Importantly, you may find that you have intellectual property that has overlaps or synergies across the organization. A lot of this is invisible to you today. As you can see, what we're doing is we're standing back at the macro level relative to other parts of this conference. We're not just simply talking about search, we're talking about telling a larger story about what's going on in your information.
Kate, I'd like to add something to that, because part of, I think, the reason that she asked me to join you guys here is because I tend to bring the legal and the compliance and information governance perspective, which is often organized around risk. A lot of this conference is looking at knowledge as an asset, but there are whole swaths of the organization that look at knowledge as information as a liability, okay? And so those are kind of two sides to the same coin. I heard a lot earlier today about enterprise search, which is fabulous, and I understand why people need to do that. But are you searching because it's an asset-based search? You're looking for information for something positive? Or are you searching for a protective, for a risk or exposure type objective? So I tend to bring, I guess maybe I'm Debbie Downer, I don't know, kind of bring that viewpoint as to why it's very important to get this information under control. It's not just the upside, there's kind of major downside that's being protected.
Great. So this is the areas, these are the areas that we're going to be covering. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by metadata in the context of enterprise discovery. We're going to talk a little bit about the auto-classification machine. What does it mean? Why do we do it? Why do we do it in an automated way? What kinds of savings do we get from those levels of automation? A little bit about the kinds of tools at our disposal and what it really does mean to be governing knowledge. This is not just knowledge management, but it's thinking at a very strategic level about opportunity and risk. So let's just start from the very top.
Okay, so I know that since this is part of the enterprise search and discovery, you guys know darn well what metadata is. I can tell you that there are parts of the organization, particularly those oriented around risk and compliance, that really don't understand that. They will understand that there's kind of dangerous or potentially dangerous content, but they won't make the link between that and metadata. And that's where I think knowledge management can play a really big role in saying it's not just legal types will tend to look at that red balloon. They'll look at essentially what's file metadata and not understand that there's content-based metadata that's very easy to have. And this is just a smattering of the type of metadata that you can get with auto-classification. There's upwards of 600, 700 different types of fields, sometimes organized by industry sector, that are available, in other words, using software, machine learning, things like that, to catalog that content so that it can be used for search or for retrieval or for many other InfoGov type topics. So this is just a smattering. And I purposely point out just the yellow balloon because it's just date. Just the concept of date. There are so many different types of dates that might be present in a document. And it's up to you guys as the knowledge thinkers to understand which dates are pertinent and often in what hierarchical order. If you take something like a contract, you might have an effective date, a termination date, certain dates that survive the termination of the contract, like confidentiality usually will extend a year or two beyond. And all of those dates have different significance for different purposes. So if you have the ability to automatically extract date, why not extract all of them?
Perfect. And also just sort of words that we're going to be using a lot. We're going to be talking about auto classification, but you could be also in another room talking about text analytics. Text analytics is using some of the basic fundamental building blocks of auto classification. We will also be talking about analytics, but we're not necessarily only talking about text analytics. We're going to be talking about other types of analytics around the larger economics of a corpus of information. You'll also be hearing a lot about natural language processing. Natural language processing is happening within an auto classification scheme. Does this move forward? So we often hear from those very same people who just said, oh, isn't metadata or aren't metadata, you can call it plural or single, depending on whether you're an English major or not, aren't metadata just there? Doesn't this just sort of happen? Isn't it just sitting on a document? If you want to explain this.
Sure, and the answer is not really. It is, when you have a structured database, people usually will understand that you have fields and fielded data, and that is thus structured data. But all the unstructured data, which is the bulk, I saw a statistic this morning that said 80% of enterprise information is unstructured. I would believe that. All the email, PowerPoints, reports, you name it, that kind of stuff. Our attempt so far to try and corral that information and add metadata is to force these type of essentially data entry screens to come up in front when you hit send or you hit save. And those are notoriously poor. People will do anything they can to circumvent those systems. If you have a way for them to save without doing it, they will do that. Otherwise, they'll just choose the A choice off of the list every time, so you get everything classified as African aardvarks. We generally frown on those type of things because they wind up giving you misinformation rather than no information, which is almost worse. Having information with the wrong metadata tags will just disrupt your search, disrupt reporting. We strongly recommend against things like this, and if you already have them in place, we kind of recommend stopping them and doing a more centralized back-end auto-classification. Take the burden off of the people. They hate it anyway.
Great. So we put a line through this. And so what does good metadata give you once you've done auto-classification? So you know what you have, you know where it is, you know its opportunity and liability, and you also have bird's eye view. Importantly, you can also operate across metadata to the extent that you can actually do some normalization. Do you want to add to this?
Sure. One of the things I'll point out, which I'm sort of surprised to not hear at this conference, is this notion of content lifecycle. It's very prominent in the records management, information governance communities, where content has a birth, a useful life, and a death. And that all of those need to be kind of organized and controlled so that you're not keeping everything forever. Because if you keep it, it's discoverable, and it might very well be in violation of your retention policies. Not good. And so this notion of knowing where content is going to be born, how it enters the sequence, how it'll be used, and that has ramifications for things like, should it be protected? Who should have access to that kind of thing? And then what happens when it hits its natural end of life? Is it just automatically deleted? Do you need authorizations for that? Should it be sequestered from a search but still alive in case somebody panics? There's a lot of different treatment of content that's reached the end of its useful life that somebody really should be thinking about, planning for, and executing and auditing. Because a lot of this type of regulation requires you to not only say how you're going to manage your content, but prove that you have done so.
That's a really good point.
Keep going? Okay. So, was there a question? No? Okay. So one of the big things that we talk about when we're talking about auto-classification is the ability to add context. Because just search alone can be dangerous. The same content might appear in a search, 4 or 5 times, but it matters the context that it came from. So here's a really good example of that. And the phrase is, I wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. And it's one thing when a cute little doggy says it. It's quite another when your employee says it. And then we have 2 other scenarios. Really kind of, if a hobo says that off the lobby of your building, or if your pilot says it on the way home. And so these would show up equally in a search. The words are the same, but the author, which is essentially a metadata field, the author, maybe the date, maybe the scene, maybe the recipient of the information, those are the things that change the meaning based on their context. And all of those are taggable metadata that you can be using to make decisions on content.
Great. And what we're learning is back and forth between the different disciplines of, auto-classification and content discovery and content management and search. They're intersecting because more and more we're seeing search engines have a social dimension where you're matched to somebody who is a like searcher. We heard that from Lee Romero and his team earlier this week. However, it does take human intervention. These context questions are extremely subtle, very, very subtle. And we all, remember pictures we'd be seeing where we had 2 faces, but we also had a vase. This is something that a human is going to be having to do as part of the equation.
Actually, Kate, before you go on, there's one other thing I'd like to point out, which is if you are in the scenario of a legal hold, typically a legal hold, if anybody's not familiar, it's content that's being locked down because it might be needed in litigation. And so if there's a legal hold situation, legal hold is typically done in a very blind way right now. The parameters for legal hold typically consist of three things: a custodian, a time frame, and subject matter. And the subject matter one is the squishy, hard one, so they'll usually just say custodian and date range, lock down everything. Not very smart, but that is what kind of gets done. And the problem with something like this is, because if you can show that the exact same content is being provided by another party, by a different custodian who's not under legal hold, there is a potential legal exposure issue there. And that is not always well understood by the legal folks. They think they've locked down the custodian, they've locked it down. If essentially the exact same content is available elsewhere, they are leaving a kind of litigation risk by not locking down the second instance. And they may not even realize, because that instance is someone else, some other custodian who's tangential that they haven't thought of yet. Again, this is where you guys can help the legal department out and say, oh, it's not just a question of custodian, it's a question of content. The same kind of content is existing elsewhere. You get the same theme on responding to GDPR requests, because sensitive data is living over here and they think of it by custodian. Oh, that's the fellow's boss. But if the same content just happens to be living over here for some tangential party, that you're still liable to report on that as part of the GDPR reporting.
So Sandy, we've talked a lot about the importance of the human, but I'm going to talk about the importance of the machine. So as a thought experiment, but actually something that I was hoping to do in order to generate a training database for another project, I downloaded from the National Archives the Cuban Missile Crisis transcripts. So these are 84 pages of things that were transcribed from tapes. The tapes were not very high quality. There's a lot of problems with them. This was then OCR'd, and I started doing some tagging and coding based on a model that I was looking at. And then I started to go and do some counting. It, you can see, is a mess. This counting is not very easy. This is simply a pivot table. The manual thing does not work. This is me doing this for, 1 hour per page. I didn't finish the task yet. I'm going to probably ask if Powerhouse can do this for me. But that's why we're going to need to understand the combination of human judgment and machine.
So this is what AutoClassification really looks like. What is essentially going on, I sometimes call it like DNA sequencing a document or a file. And so it's going through and essentially parsing this content and understanding all these different data elements. Now, in part, it knows the document type. That's kind of a key cornerstone to doing this type of analysis. And by the way, this was not trained by a human. This is essentially, it runs on a rules-based technique. It's looking for certain phrases, it's looking for certain formats, and it's using statistical probability to determine the document type. So in this case, it's kind of got a dead ringer. It's got patent application publication right there on the top of the document. That's kind of we call that a slam dunk. So it knows what type this is, and based on that, you can infer what types of fields you would expect to find present in this document. So you would expect to find inventor, assignee, dates, obviously. And you would not expect to find, construction change order, medical record number, sales forecasts for the quarter. Those would be in other doc types. And so it kind of works both directions. On the one hand, doc type tells you sort of what to look for, but the other data nuggets reinform the fact that it's a patent application. So you kind of get this bidirectional enforcement of the statistical values. That's how it works. And so what you come away with at the end of the day is essentially a list of metadata tags that are available for all kinds of future analysis and all kinds of future disposition for legal or information governance purposes.
All right, so we talked a little bit about some of the blocking and tackling, the basics of metadata. What is it, why we need humans, why we need the machines, what kinds of things we can discover. But the secret sauce is what you called rules. Tell us a little about rules.
Sure. So there's kind of two parts to auto-classification. The first is this very detailed specific tagging that you saw, and the second is rules. So rules are, actually I think if we go on to the next, yeah. So rules are essentially like elaborate if-then statements. So if certain conditions are met, and those conditions are typically derived from the tags themselves. So if you look at this, this is a retention tag, and a retention rule, and it's looking at the tags that are in italics of document type and date or some variant of date. And so it's combining that information and saying if these conditions are met, then take the following action, or then take sort of a summary effort or summary tag that is inferred from the others. So this is a little bit how auto-classification works, and it's indicating, one, how long that content should be retained, and I didn't get into it on this slide, but it could very well say, okay, and is this therefore it's this type of record, it has this type of end of life, this type of handling throughout its life. You can even get as fancy as, and this is where it should live in the organization, a concept we call recommended file location, or RFL. In other words, where should this content live in the vast ecosystem of the organization? And yes, it does set up an automatic taxonomy. Somebody came up to us in the last one saying, I don't want to have to build a taxonomy for my organization. You don't really, if you don't have one, systems like this can generate one for you based on the content and the logic and essentially the preponderance of that logic.
And this is language that you guys have been seeing all week. The additional piece to this is the outcome is not present to user who's in a search box or present to user who's doing a knowledge act and needs to have, content suggested to them. This is also going to tell you dispositions. I wanted to come quickly back to this slide. So in addition to using rules to derive decisions around the presence of a tag, these rules also say, given tags, given doc types and other types of tags, these might be activity that you undertake. Data privacy, sequestering it because it shouldn't be exposed or should be, evaluated. E-discovery, you talked about that before, legal hold. The I in there is because at some point I saw I in ROT and I thought, oh, maybe that was what this should be added. So it's supposed to say ROT. Tell us again what ROT stands for.
Sure, ROT is a kind of common sort of records or information governance term for redundant, obsolete, and trivial, basically junk. And it's the kind of stuff that really should be removed from your organization. Again, don't keep it, it's discoverable. Two, you're paying to store it or search it or manage it one way or another. And three, it's causing clutter in a way that prevents people from getting to the information that they actually need. So these are things that are ROT. Auto-reply emails, logo files. Now, I don't just mean a logo in your marketing group. I mean, take a look at your email sometime. There's usually 20, 30,000 copies of your own company's logo being stored because it's technically an attachment to every email that you send or receive from a colleague in your organization. So that kind of stuff is ROT. And a typical organization generally has about 30 to 40% ROT in their content. That is a huge number. Not in this, but you can come to my website or ask me. We've calculated what ROT is actually costing most organizations. If you're looking for an ROI for these types of things, that's your ROI, because removing ROT should save your organization several $1 million every year.
So we went through this one.
Yep.
The next one is an illustration of the application of a rules engine to achieve those kinds of outcomes.
Right, so if you are relatively computer literate, either you know scripting or you can do macros, you know what a regex is. If you can handle that level of kind of scripting and content manipulation, all of this is available to you. So just to kind of show, you can support word stemming and word strings, you can support pattern matching. And one of the ones I like too is if you have what we call guidance data, in other words, information that helps set up a rules engine. So things like here's a list of employees, or here's a list of product names, or here's a fancy one, here's a connector or a subscription to an online database that's tracking privacy regulation around the world. Then the rules can essentially self-create and self-modify by pointing to these guidance data locations so that the work is not on you, and it's certainly not on the users to stay current with whatever the rules need to be aware of or be guided by. So again, there's some sophistication in there and some automated self-updating that keep these systems current and perpetual.
So this is another example where it's using auto-classification, recognizing patterns to determine which of these items are PII. And it can redact based on certain requirements. So if this is going to be stored, and it's really a knowledge object as opposed to a transaction object, then this can be removed. So this is PII here, phone numbers, addresses. I think we decided the 6.5% is not anything, but this could be used to up-level and look at other different, what are these? These are filings for mortgages, right?
Mm-hmm. There's a mortgage application. So any financial services organization is going to have these. There's massive amounts of personal data contained within this. I'm sort of surprised how little I heard about personal data at this conference. Over in the legal space, this is the thing keeping everybody up at night. And you would be amazed where personal data lives in our organization. Someone did a presentation earlier where they typed in the word password. And the passwords just came up. Like, that's just like a litigation, like a data privacy disaster. And part of what these technologies do are help surface that so that they can be either automatically managed or at least notified that that type of situation is taking place.
Okay, so now we're talking about it in action. We talked about metadata, the construct of metadata. We've talked a little bit about how the rules get applied, what kind of strategy might lie behind them, and how those strategies get enacted. Let's talk now about the entire governance lifecycle.
Right, so this is how the whole kind of situation unfolds. Typically, this kind of technology processes in place, meaning the files stay where they are. You can also sort of what would be called, the flip side of it is called ingestion, where a copy of the files is moved to the system. Generally, we don't recommend that. We want to be working on live files because those are the ones that are the most exposure to the organization. So there's a processing in place, and what is happening during processing is a couple of things. One, we need to get to text because this is text analytics at the end of the day. So either we're extracting native text from a native file, we're running OCR if it's a scanned image, and if it's near text, so things like audio or video, gonna run through a speech-to-text engine. You heard some of that this morning. One way or another, getting to some sort of text space to be able to do these analytics, and then going through that tagging step of that DNA sequencing step of getting every little bit of information in a kind of metadata record that you can get, and then running those rules to determine disposition now, future, conditional, event-based. These are all flavors of disposition. And then eventually running into a perpetual evergreen mode. A lot of folks think that, like you'll hear, oh, we're gonna do a file share cleanup. I love that. I'm like, forever? Or is it this a one-shot? One-shot doesn't really work because just like in your house, you might clean the bathroom today, it will get dirty again. And the same with all of our data shares. They're going to get filled up with rot. They're going to get filled up with sensitive data. And so you really have to kind of evolve to a perpetual auditing, monitoring mode. You might clean up in the beginning, but you have to kind of stay vigilant after that. And that's what some of this regulation also requires. GDPR requires that you do it on a frequency, that you dictate what your frequency is, and then you execute and can prove that you've done so.
So I have a quick question. So when you're sitting with your lawyer and your lawyer is doing a health check, do they also ask for you to ask questions about all these other things, like your suitability for a future discovery, or, yeah.
Well, what's funny is it's not usually the lawyer that's going to do that health check. There are some, but it's probably more likely a consultant, because the lawyer on the one hand doesn't exactly want to ask the question, because then they're obligated by the answer. So be careful of that, okay? So if the lawyer asks you basically, are you doing something illegal, and you answer yes, they must act on that. So they tend not to ask that question. Consultants will ask that question. That said, there are some of the regulations require, like GDPR requires a data privacy officer. You must name someone with that title, and they have to certify and approve that they are in fact in compliance. So there are some records managers that are also required to do that, typically for public companies. And so there are some roles who now have that on their head.
So I was with a firm that was able to go and find conflicts of interest. So they had some policies about certain clients with whom they couldn't do work because of other types of dealings. And this was the process that they used to go and see the names in there, which might, in that context, be fine, but at least they could surface it and go look at it from a bird's eye view.
Okay, so this takes us to data visualization, which is a fancy word for essentially what it might be like if search results were returned in a slightly different way, in a faceted way. So this is a data dashboard, and what you're looking at are charts and graphs that represent the various auto-classification fields. So they can be the first order fields like date, titles, author, keyword, things like that, or they can be the second order field, which are those derived ones, ROT, expiration dates, sensitive data present, security lockdown, you name it, it can be here. And so what these kind of interfaces mostly bring your colleagues, is that they don't have to be any kind of sophisticated search goddess to be able to use this information. You can craft, the most fabulous Boolean string ever, but you could also these are lives. You can click and drill down, and the facets basically act like filters. You can string them together, you can dive in, you can go larger, go smaller, and it's a way for people to self-serve a little bit more by utilizing the facets that the systems have essentially tagged and made available in a kind of easy chewable format.
And the facets are independent of the underlying databases. So they can be in different formats, different locations. It doesn't, the ability to go and point to a location doesn't require that you're actually having to have them, in your possession or on your site.
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to that. So I'll give an example of one version of that. A large client of ours has contracts in 18 different repositories. They're a huge organization, and they have contracts in 18 different repositories around the world. And the legal team needed access to all of them, but they officially belong to the various business units. So this is a centralized data structure that lets them see the content that's in all these locations without actually having to take physical domain of them. And to know things like, what's the confidentiality clause on all of them? Or I want to look at blah-de-blah type contracts in this time window with these kind of keywords. What do I need to know? So it's this sort of abstracted layer presented up visually.
And we're going to be short on time, so we're just going to quickly go through these
Yep.
other types of visualization. Here's your graph, your knowledge graph, looking at entities and also objects, knowledge objects. This is another sort of bird's eye view of, just the same as this one here, retention. This is a retention dashboard. And this is also other types of retention dashboards, a little bit more sort of sliced and diced, as well as this. So let's talk about case studies. We have 3 case studies for you. They are covering manufacturing, effectively professional services, and retail. So let's go ahead and start. So these are the 3. Just thinking, do any of these look like you? Are any of you guys in oil and gas? Anybody in retail? Professional services, what industries are you guys in? CPG, okay, good. Well, manufacturing will have some overlaps with you. What else? Who's in other industries? I'm sorry. Great.
Oh, pharma.
And we've got pharma, and we've also got professional services, because I know Eve, you're in that. And Tom, you're in it? R&D and government. So you probably have some information not unlike our last one. So let's talk about this first one, Sandy.
Sure. So this is actually the same organization that has the 18 repositories of contracts. They operate in 26 countries, have 90,000 employees. They have data everywhere. And part of what they're trying to do is identify essentially use cases that can benefit from this type of technology. We're up to 24 use cases and counting. To give you an example of some of the other ones, I mentioned the contracts one. Another one is they are having to fulfill DSARs, data subject access requests, under GDPR. So using this type of technology to pre-tag sensitive data, and then when the DSAR comes in, just plug the person's name in and turn it right around in about 1 day. That's down from the 30 to 45 days that they're in right now. So that's another great use case.
And their situation too is they had recently done an acquisition. They had no idea what the knowledge meant, where it lived, what was any kind of liability from a PII perspective. They didn't know what the retention policies, if any, had previously existed. And the acquisition did not bring over a lot of the subject matter experts. Some of them didn't come, yeah. They didn't want to join the party.
This is very common in HR, because when organizations merge, the prevailing wisdom is you only need one HR department. So you inherit the HR data from the acquisition company, and none of the people who know how it was structured, why it's in there, what it says. And so the recipient party is left with, in this case, a 200 terabyte drive of, here you go, good luck with that. And they, the receiving party was in 70 litigation matters at one time. The acquired party was in maybe 35. Where's the overlap? Which things are under legal hold? What is this stuff? That's when you hear people saying, what is this content? That's like a siren call for auto-classification.
And speaking of HR, in this example, which I'll do really quickly, this was the existence of a lot of different restaurants that each had their own HR data store. And that meant that they opened up the lid and saw different contract clauses, different privacy treatments, and different governance issues with the retention policies. So there were some stumbling blocks there. Last but not least.
So I'm curious if anybody is with an organization that is in the business of purposely acquiring information so as to mine it and resell it. I would call that a clearinghouse or a data aggregator. There are all kinds of special considerations on that type of organization. But we tend to see this technology being used there because their goal is to literally take that content, abstract out metadata, mine it, and sell it. And so obviously this is a very good platform for that. And there are all kinds of efficiencies and special considerations that go into that type of business.
And this is our last slide. This is the bottom line here. So I'll do the first one, you do the second two. So I'm quoting Sandy on this. She doesn't like it, I quote her, but she said it's just like, once you start doing this, you're actually laying bare a lot. Just in the same way you have a lawyer that doesn't want to ask questions, there may be people in your organizations who don't want to ask these questions either. It's like walking around with all the labels on the outside, which I was walking behind somebody today who had the label on the back, and I was thinking about
you thought of them.
Yeah, just put that in for you. And then also here, why don't you do the second one?
Sure. So obviously the secret sauce to all of this is the rules engine. And one of my cautions is that's where all the effort goes in. Because this stuff is hard. Most people have not thought about what they have, let alone how they want to treat it. And so it opens up sometimes a bit of a Pandora's box of, just like that lawyer, you have to kind of face the facts of what you have and what that means. And not all organizations are always equipped to do that. It's a really good role that you folks in knowledge management can play. One, to help calm them down, and two, to guide them through those kinds of decisions. It's not necessarily a frightening thing. There's just a certain amount, just like there's a taxonomy or a decision tree, the same kind of thing applies to the handling of content.
And that's it, it's information governance. How many of you guys are responsible for working in this space? Discovery, information governance, anything around sort of having the bird's eye view of your information in addition to search? Anybody else in this group? So Eve, you are. Anybody else?
But I think it's important for those who don't have it as their primary responsibility to be aware of all the things we've talked about, because being responsible for the search function means you've got to know this stuff.
Right. And I submit to you that this group is going to, KM World is going to start to converge with a lot of the information governance groups over time. A lot of the underlying natural language processing, AutoClassification, text analytics, AI, machine learning, those are going to start to converge. So these are going to be things that are going to be increasing on your plate. Any last questions before we depart? Go ahead.
Oh, a couple. One, you were saying earlier that lawyers didn't know that have information out there about explosive legal risks. You're saying lawyers didn't have legal knowledge, or they didn't know what these other people had documents?
I'll field that one. Lawyers tend to think per custodian. That's how they've been taught. And so they think, oh, this is a custodian who matters. It's somebody that I'm going to have to handle a deposition with. And they don't think in terms of content. So they don't think that whatever this custodian knows might also exist somewhere else. They're just thinking about the person instead of the content. When we open their eyes to content and say, these are the issues that you are thinking about, and they exist here, 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 and here, that usually is quite an eye-opener for them, because it kind of unleashes or unveils custodians they never considered before.
The other quick one was talking about regular expressions. So I have the question, what's the underlying language you're using there?
You can use Python if you're looking for that. Well, some of it is, but it's not as a language. It says kind of checkboxy things or enter a pattern. It's kind of wizarded out for you so that you don't have to learn a language.
Well, he's probably a good geek. Why don't you tell him what it is?
I don't know. I'm not, I mean, I just sit down and go, I want this, and it goes. I have no idea what the underlying language is.
Okay, good. Any other questions before we close out? Thank you. You guys have been amazing.
Thank you both.
Thank you.